Today, when looking for a flight between destinations within Australia, you'll find yourself looking at one of several options. Qantas, Virgin, Jetstar, the recently launched Bonza, and yet only a little over 30 years ago, none of these airlines existed or flew domestically. The market was instead dominated by Ansett Australia and Trans-Australia Airlines. As for Ansett, Mood Transit has or will have a video on that linked now, but in this video we will have a look at the bit under 5 decades of TAA's history, from its inception through its demise. From the beginning of civil aviation in the 1920s, Australia had begun to lead the world in aviation. Of course, plane travel remained a luxury available only to the upper class, but nonetheless, Australian governments recognised the importance of aviation to the country, thanks to sparse populations that were centred in dense major cities, particularly along the east coast as well as Perth. It was clear that aviation would play a major role in interstate and long-distance transport, as the competing interstate railway network was slow and included many break of gauges at the time. This led to public subsidies and mail contracts being available to airlines, encouraging the development of airlines and passenger aviation in the country. However, following the outbreak of World War II, the country's aviation industry practically stopped overnight, with most planes and equipment being used for military needs. Following the end of the war, there were 9 domestic airlines, however only one of these, Australian National Airways or ANA, serviced major interstate trunk routes. This practically led to a monopoly, and the left-leaning Labor government of the time was not satisfied with this. They believed that air travel was a public service, and if it was to be a monopoly, it should be owned by the people. In August 1945, a bill was passed in Australian Parliament creating the Australian National Airways Commission, which was originally intended to create an airline monopoly, but owing to a High Court challenge, this was unable to occur. Instead, the Commission would have to compete with ANA, or whatever other airlines might form in the future, and so they formed the new airline Trans-Australia Airlines. The airline acquired its first aircraft, some Douglas DC-3s, some of the more advanced aircraft of the time. This was later followed by the acquisition of several DC-4s, a larger and more advanced version of the former. By 1946, the airline was almost ready to start, and it commenced operations early on the 9th of September for various complicated political reasons, before starting public passenger service on the 7th of October. TAA's first flight was operated by a Douglas DC-3, registration Victor Hotel Alpha Echo Sierra, or for people who don't understand plane speak, VHAES, known as Skyliner Horden, flying from Melbourne's Laverton Air Force Base to Sydney, taking around 3 hours to do so. Many of TAA's early aircraft were ex-US military aircraft, converted for passenger flights after they became surplus to requirements. The airline continued to expand through its first few years, acquiring its inaugural Convair 240, a more modern aircraft than its DC-3s. New destinations continued to be added as well, and new services like mail and parcels being carried on board passenger flights. The airline added many new aircraft types throughout the 1950s, including the Vickers Viscount and Fokker F-27 Friendship. However, a major change in the Australian aviation industry occurred in the 1950s with the introduction of the Two Airlines policy. This policy set a number of restrictions on Australian airlines, whereby TAA and the private Ansett ANA would use the same aircraft on the same routes with the same fares at the same time. This also prevented any other airlines from competing on interstate routes, however they could also operate regional routes. It was largely designed to protect the needs of the private Ansett against a potential buyout by the government TAA, as well as to protect competition. However, it led to a number of issues arising. For example, TAA wanted to introduce the modern Sudaviation Caravelle, a new jet airliner. But as Ansett was unable to use these aircraft at the time, TAA was instead forced to acquire the Lockheed Electra, an older turboprop aircraft. Following the introduction of the Two Airlines policy, Qantas was forced out of Papua New Guinea as this was controlled by Australia at the time. Qantas was only allowed to fly international routes, and so this meant it transferred its Papua New Guinea internal network, as well as flights from Australia, to TAA. TAA thus established the TAA Sunbird brand, and it had a major advantage over Ansett ANA, which barely served Papua New Guinea. By 1961, the airline had carried more than 10 million passengers, and it served 139 destinations. However, by the early to mid-1960s, jet airliners had become the international standard, and TAA finally entered the jet age with the acquisition of Boeing 727-100 jets in 1964. The first of these was operated in early November of that year, just after Ansett's introduction of the jets. This was later followed by the introduction of the Douglas DC-9 jet aircraft, and the airline now practically connected every major city around the continent, as well as reaching into Papua New Guinea and Timor. The airline also painted several of its aircraft to represent parts of the country, including Central Australia's Red Dirt and Uluru, as well as another jet known as the Coral Islander. However, only 2 jets were ever completed, despite several more designs being produced. In 1980, TAA introduced flights to New Zealand, while it also began to introduce different aircraft to Ansett for the first time. Around this time, a major new aircraft design changed the industry. Until 1970, all passenger aircraft had just one aisle and were often very cramped, being known as narrowbodies. However, the introduction of the famous Boeing 747 changed this, with this new aircraft having 2 aisles, being known as a widebody. The first widebody aircraft all had 3 or 4 engines, and the 747 went on to serve with Qantas from 1971 until retirement in 2020. However, domestically within Australia, there was potential for widebodies too. The busy east coast routes between Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane in any order had substantial demand which could not always be met with single-aisle aircraft. As well as this, transcontinental flights to Perth would be more comfortable on widebodies. After removal of some of the 2 airline policy in the late 1970s, intended to allow other cargo airlines to operate, as well as allowing domestic airlines to have slightly less restrictions on their aircraft choices, TAA and Ansett faced the choice on widebodies. While Ansett introduced the widebody Boeing 767, TAA introduced the Airbus A300. This was a major step up for the airline, however during periods of economic downturn, it became hard to fill. TAA thus leased out its A300s to other airlines several times. These jets went on to serve with both TAA and Qantas, eventually being retired in the late 1990s. And the legacy of these planes continues with A330 and 787-9 aircraft used on domestic Qantas flights to this day. The TAA brand had started to tire a little, and so in 1986 it was decided to rebrand the airline. A change of management led to the airline being rebranded as Australian Airlines, with a new livery and aircraft title. This was somewhat controversial, as TAA had become a well-known and well-loved brand, but it lasted and was relatively successful. However, it wasn't just the TAA name that faced demise. The government of the day decided to deregulate and privatise much of the aviation market. By December 1990, the aviation industry had been deregulated, but a 1989 aviation workers' strike had already led to the resignation of most of Australian Airlines staff. This was not all, however. Despite Australian Airlines seeing large profits and having increasingly large passenger numbers, the days of the airline would soon come to an end. The federal government wished to privatise both Qantas and Australian. The government offered Australian first, however it was simply bought out by Qantas. Qantas itself was subsequently privatised, beginning with a 25% stake sold to British Airways. On the 14th of September 1992, Qantas acquired Australian Airlines and began the process of shutting it down. Qantas retired its final 727 in December, and slowly but surely the brands were merged together. Qantas changed its slogan to The Australian Airline, aircraft were slowly repainted in the Qantas livery, Australian Airlines services like lounges were rebranded to Qantas, flights were changed from TN to QF, and eventually the Australian Airlines brand completely disappeared. The final remnant of Australian Airlines was the in-flight magazine The Australian Way, finally rebranded as the Qantas magazine 2 decades later. A brief revival occurred in 2002, when Qantas reintroduced the Australian Airlines brand as a new carrier to be primarily based out of Cairns. The airline used several aircraft leased from Qantas, however in 2006 it was disbanded, with Qantas instead focusing on the development of Jetstar. A museum was also established in Airport West, which I was unfortunately unable to visit. Qantas also has 2 retro-roo aircraft, albeit currently only painted in Qantas liveries, but hopefully one day a modern jet might carry the colours of TAA or Australian as a retro-roo. Even today, several aircraft from the airline remain up in the skies. Although not used for passenger flights anymore, 3 ex-Australian Boeing 737-300s are still made useful by Qantas. These aircraft are now used as freighters after many years in passenger service, although they will be replaced in the near future by newer Airbus jets. As well as this, several ex-TAA aircraft are preserved, including most notably the airline's very first aircraft, Victor Hotel Alpha Echo Sierra, preserved at the Historical Aircraft Restoration Society in Wollongong, New South Wales. Another aircraft, A Vickers Viscount registration Victor Hotel Tango Victor Romeo is slowly being restored at Moorabbin Air Museum. In retrospect, it is very interesting to think about what might have happened had Qantas and TEA not merged. The merger made quite a bit of sense, however the industry could possibly be very different had it not happened. Perhaps Australian and Qantas would have become rivals, competing as domestic and international airlines, or Ansett may have bought out Australian, or perhaps Australian would have remained a domestic carrier only, even code-sharing with Qantas or eventually just merging down the line. That was the history of our TAA, the nation's jet line, the Friendly Way, a treasured piece of Australian aviation history. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll have a link to Moo Transit's video on Ansett in the top right corner when it's released.